What if you wanted a divorce, but realized you couldn't afford to leave? Your house traps you. Your pension isn't enough. Your children can't help. So what do you do when staying hurts? And leaving might destroy you. Today, on Late Truths, this is the story of a couple who discovered the truth too late and then made a choice no one expected. Susan Miller woke up at 5:47 a.m. The same way she had for nearly 4 decades. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic somewhere beyond the cul-de-sac. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a reason to get up. There wasn't one. Not anymore. At 64, Susan was retired. Officially, no more lesson plans. No more staff meetings. No more students calling her Mrs. Miller in the hallway. Teaching had been exhausting, yes, but it had also been proof that she mattered, that someone needed her. Now, the only thing waiting for her was the kitchen. She slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake David. Her husband's steady breathing filled the room, familiar and oddly distant. David had retired 6 months earlier, and, since then, he was always home. Always sitting. Always watching the news, or sports, or reruns of shows Susan had never liked. In the kitchen, Susan started the coffee, cracked 2 eggs, and set the pan on the stove. The routine moved through her body without thought, muscle memory built over 38 years of marriage. David appeared a few minutes later, already dressed, already holding the remote control like an extension of his hand. "Morning," he said, eyes still on the TV. "Morning," Susan replied. That was it. No thank you. No question about how she slept. No acknowledgement that breakfast didn't magically appear. As she placed the plate in front of him, a thought surfaced, quiet, unwelcome, but persistent. Is this what the rest of my life looks like? For years, Susan had told herself she was just tired. Tired from teaching. Tired from raising a daughter. Tired from managing a household that never seemed to run on its own. But now she was retired too. And the tiredness hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown heavier. She wasn't angry. That was the strangest part. She wasn't furious with David. He wasn't cruel. He had never cheated. He had worked hard, provided steadily, paid off the house they bought when Susan was still in her 20s. By all measurable standards, David Miller was a good husband. And yet, Susan felt invisible. Every day blurred into the next. Dishes, laundry, grocery lists, doctor appointments. David helped. Technically, he took out the trash twice a week. He mowed the lawn once a month. In his mind, he was doing his part. In Susan's mind, she was slowly disappearing. She watched him eat in silence, the television casting blue light across his face, and wondered when they had stopped talking. Not arguing, talking, sharing, asking. She didn't remember the exact moment it happened. Only that one day, she realized she no longer felt like a wife. She felt like unpaid labor. She carried that thought with her all morning. Through the grocery store, through folding laundry, through the quiet afternoon where no one asked her opinion on anything at all. By evening, the thought had sharpened into something else, something frightening. I can't live like this forever. The word came to her slowly, cautiously, like stepping onto thin ice. Divorce. The idea scared her more than it comforted her. Susan wasn't naive. She knew she wasn't 35 anymore. She knew starting over at her age wasn't romantic. It was risky. Possibly reckless. Still, the thought wouldn't leave. That night, as David sat across from her at the kitchen table, talking about the neighbor's new truck, Susan felt a strange pressure in her chest, a mix of fear and resolve. She interrupted him. "David," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. We need to talk about us." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss." David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "About what?" Susan swallowed. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "I'm exhausted, and I don't think you even see it." David frowned. "Doing what?" "We're retired. Things are supposed to be easier now." "For you," Susan replied. The words hung in the air between them. She looked at the man she had spent nearly 4 decades with, the father of her child, the person she had built an entire life beside, and felt both love and an unbearable loneliness at the same time. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "that maybe we should consider getting a divorce." David stared at her, stunned. "A divorce?" he repeated. "At our age? That's ridiculous." Susan didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply said the truth she had been carrying alone for far too long. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling invisible." David opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to list everything he had done for this family, but no words came out. Because, for the first time, he saw something in Susan's eyes he didn't recognize. Not anger, not bitterness, but quiet desperation. And neither of them yet understood that saying the word divorce was only the beginning. Because what lay ahead wasn't freedom, or escape, or relief. It was a reality neither of them was prepared to face. The word divorce didn't explode between them. It settled. It hung in the air above the kitchen table like dust after something heavy had fallen. Quiet, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. David Miller stared at Susan as if she had spoken in another language. "A divorce," he repeated, slower this time. "Susan, come on. You don't mean that." Susan folded her hands in her lap. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. She had imagined this moment so many times that the fear had already burned itself out. "I didn't say it lightly," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." David shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense. We're fine. We're retired. This is supposed to be the easy part." Susan let out a small, humorless breath. "Easy for who?" David leaned forward, his voice tightening. "What are you saying? That I'm doing something wrong?" "I'm saying I'm tired," Susan replied. "And I don't think you hear me." "I hear you," he said quickly. "I'm listening right now." She looked at him for a long moment. Listening isn't the same as understanding. That stung. David felt it immediately. He had spent his entire life believing that being steady, dependable, and quiet was enough. He had worked long hours so Susan wouldn't have to worry about money. He had shown up when it mattered, or at least when he thought it mattered. "What exactly is it you want from me?" he asked. "I'm not a mind reader." Susan stood up and began clearing the table, stacking plates that were already clean. The movement gave her something to do with her hands. "I want you to see me," she said. "I want you to notice that I'm still working every day. That just because I'm not earning a paycheck anymore doesn't mean I stopped carrying everything." David frowned. "I help." You take out the trash, she said quietly. And you mow the lawn. That's not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing, Susan replied. But it's not enough. He pushed his chair back, standing now. So what? You want me to apologize for working hard for 38 years? No, she said, turning to face him. I want you to stop acting like that's the only thing that counts. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument they'd ever had. David rubbed his temples. This is crazy, he muttered. You're talking about throwing away everything we built. For what? Because you're bored. Susan flinched. I'm not bored, she said. Her voice wavered for the first time. I'm lonely. That word landed differently. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. Loneliness wasn't something he had prepared a response for. He had always assumed that being together in the same house was enough to prevent it. We're married, he said finally. You're not alone. Susan's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. I can be married and still feel completely alone. He wanted to argue, to list facts, to defend himself with logic. But something in her tone stopped him. When was the last time you asked how I was really doing? She asked. Not, did you sleep okay? Or, what's for dinner? But actually asked. David searched his memory. Nothing came to him. Susan nodded slowly, as if she already knew the answer. I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling like background noise, she said. Like the house runs because I make it run, and no one even notices. David felt anger rise, hot and defensive. So that's it? You're done? You just get to walk away? I don't want to walk away, Susan said. I want relief. From me, he snapped. She hesitated. From this. David turned toward the window, staring out at the quiet street. He saw the house they had moved into when Rachel was still in diapers. He remembered painting the walls, fixing the fence, coming home exhausted and trusting that Susan would handle everything else. He had never asked how much that trust cost her. This house, he said slowly, this life, it didn't just happen. I worked my whole life for it. So did I, Susan replied. Her voice wasn't angry. That was what frightened him most. She continued, softer now. I worked all day, then came home and worked some more. I raised our daughter. I managed everything you didn't have time to think about. And I never asked for credit. I just wanted to be acknowledged. David turned back to her. And now you want a divorce. Susan closed her eyes. I don't know what I want. I just know I can't keep pretending this is enough. The word divorce echoed again in his mind, heavier now, more real. You know what happens if we divorce? He asked. We sell the house, split what's left, start over with nothing. Susan nodded. I know. Where would you even go? He pressed. Do you think it's easy to rent at our age? I don't know, she admitted. But staying feels like disappearing. That scared him more than any financial consequence. David sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. This wasn't the argument he expected. There were no clear villains, no obvious solution. Only two people sitting across from each other, both afraid, both hurting, neither knowing how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. We've been married almost 40 years, he said quietly. You're telling me it might end like this? Susan's voice broke at last. I'm telling you it already feels like it has. Neither of them spoke after that. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting seconds neither wanted to acknowledge. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the bed, facing away from each other. The space between them felt wider than the room itself. And for the first time since they had said their vows, both Susan and David lay awake wondering the same terrifying thing. What if staying hurts just as much as leaving? Susan sat in the small reception area of the law office, hands folded tightly around her purse. The sign on the wall read, "Family Law and Late Life Transitions." She hadn't noticed it when she made the appointment, but now the words felt uncomfortably precise. Late life transitions. As if there were something graceful about it. When the attorney called her name, Susan followed her down a narrow hallway into an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The woman introduced herself as Janet Collins, a specialist in what she called gray divorce. "It's more common than people think," Janet said kindly as Susan sat down. "But that doesn't make it easier." Susan nodded. She hadn't told David she was here. Not because she was hiding anything. She just needed to understand the reality before saying another word. "Let's start with the basics," Janet said, opening a folder. "Do you and your husband own your home?" "Yes," Susan replied. "We paid it off years ago." "And how long have you lived there?" 35 years. Janet tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Do you know the current market value?" Susan hesitated. "The houses around us are selling for about $300,000. Maybe a little more." Janet nodded. "That sounds about right." "Now, after fees, taxes, and the costs of selling, you'd likely walk away with around $280,000. Split evenly. That's roughly $40,000 each." Susan stared at her. 40,000. She repeated. "Yes," Janet said gently. "Give or take." The number felt unreal. Susan had imagined something else, something safer. She had never thought of the house as an investment. It was a place where birthdays happened, where Rachel took her first steps, where Susan had folded thousands of loads of laundry and cooked countless meals. And now, it was a number on a page. "Oh, $40,000, Susan said again, quieter this time. "That's not enough to start over." Janet didn't disagree. "That's usually the hardest part." Susan leaned back in her chair, her chest tight. "What about renting?" Janet sighed softly, the way someone does when delivering bad news they've delivered too many times before. "At 64, renting can be challenging," she said. "Many landlords are hesitant. Income requirements are stricter. Security deposits are higher. And that's assuming you're approved at all." Susan swallowed. "And senior housing?" "There are waiting lists," Janet replied. "Sometimes years long. And many require an entry fee, anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000. Susan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So if I divorce," she said slowly, "I lose the house, and still might not have anywhere to live." Janet met her eyes. That's often the reality. The room felt suddenly smaller. Susan glanced at the window, watching a leafless tree sway slightly in the wind. "I always thought the house was our safety," she said. "Our backup plan." "In later life divorces," Janet replied, "the house often becomes the biggest obstacle. It's not just a home anymore. It's the main asset and the main source of limitation." Susan nodded, numb. "There is another option," Janet added. "One spouse can buy out the other's share." Susan almost laughed. "With what money?" Janet smiled sympathetically. That's usually the problem. Susan thought of David's retirement account, most of it already accounted for. Thought of her own modest pension. Thought of how carefully they had planned for together, never for apart. What happens if we don't divorce? Susan asked quietly. Janet paused. Then none of this happens. Susan left the office feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because she finally knew the truth. Heavier because the truth offered no escape. When she got home, David was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through mail. You're back early, he said. I went to see a lawyer, Susan replied. His hands froze. And? He asked carefully. She set her purse down, sat across from him, and took a deep breath. If we sell the house, she said, we each walk away with about $40,000. David frowned. That's it. That's it. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. And that wouldn't even cover a year of rent. I know, Susan said. And renting at our age? He continued. They won't even look at us. Susan nodded. David stared at the table, the weight of the numbers settling in. So, this house, he said slowly, is the only thing keeping us afloat. Susan didn't argue. That's not freedom, he muttered. That's a trap. The word stung because it was true. They sat in silence, both staring at the same table they had eaten at for decades, now seeing it differently. That lawyer, David said. She didn't sugarcoat it, did she? No, Susan replied. She said divorce at our age isn't about starting over. It's about survival. David exhaled sharply. I spent my whole life thinking this house was proof I did my job. Susan looked at him. It was. Just not in the way we thought. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room. The house felt quieter than usual, not peaceful, just heavy with meaning. Susan realized then that wanting a divorce and being able to afford one were two very different things. And, for the first time, she wondered if she wasn't trapped in a marriage, but in the reality of aging itself. The house hadn't changed. They had. 2 days after meeting the lawyer, Susan found herself sitting at a small cafe near the library, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The place was quiet, mid-morning on a weekday, filled mostly with retirees and a few people working on laptops. She used to come here grading papers, complaining about students. Now she was here for a very different reason. Across from her sat Karen Whitfield, a certified financial planner Susan had known years ago through a district workshop. Karen's hair had gone gray since then, but her expression was still sharp and steady. I'm glad you came, Karen said gently. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Susan hesitated, then told her everything. The exhaustion. The word divorce. The house. The lawyer's numbers. She tried to keep her voice even, but by the end, her hands were trembling slightly. Karen listened without interrupting. When Susan finished, she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Let's talk about income. That word alone made Susan tense. You were a public school teacher for 32 years, Karen continued. So you're drawing from the state pension system, correct? Yes. And you retired last year? Yes. Karen opened her tablet and did a few quick calculations. Your monthly pension comes out to about $1,600 before taxes. Susan nodded. That sounds right. If you and David divorce, Karen went on, you may be eligible for a portion of his Social Security benefits under spousal rules. That could raise your monthly income to around $1,800, maybe $1,900, depending. Susan's eyes widened just a little. That's more than I thought. Karen held up a hand. It sounds better than it is. She turned the tablet so Susan could see. Let's be realistic. If you're renting a modest one-bedroom apartment, you're looking at $1,200 to $1,400 a month. Utilities, $200. Food, $300 to $400, if you're careful. Medicare premiums. Supplemental insurance. Out-of-pocket medical expenses. The numbers added themselves up in Susan's head faster than Karen spoke them. That's already more than $2,000, Susan said. Karen nodded. And that's before anything unexpected. Susan swallowed. Like getting sick. Exactly, Karen said. A single hospitalization can wipe out a year's worth of savings. Susan leaned back in her chair, suddenly dizzy. So, even with the pension, it's not enough. Karen's voice softened. It's enough to survive. Not necessarily enough to live comfortably. Susan stared down at the table, at the small scratch near the edge that someone had carved years ago. She thought about the life she had imagined when she retired, traveling, volunteering, slow mornings without stress. What if I'm careful? Susan asked. What if I cut back? Karen smiled sadly. Most of my clients say that. And they do. They cut back on eating out, on gifts, on hobbies, on seeing friends, and eventually they start cutting back on joy. That word hit Susan harder than the numbers. Joy. So what you're saying, Susan said quietly, is that divorce would make me poor. Karen didn't sugarcoat it. It would make you financially fragile. Susan closed her eyes. The phrase echoed in her mind. Financially fragile. She had spent her entire adult life trying not to be that. There's something else, Karen added. When couples plan for retirement, they plan as a unit. One house. Shared expenses. Shared risk. Divorce doesn't just split assets. It multiplies costs. Susan opened her eyes. So, staying married is cheaper? Yes, Karen said simply. Susan let out a bitter laugh. I never thought that would be the reason I stayed married. Karen didn't laugh with her. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I'm telling you what it costs. Susan sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing that. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Karen met her eyes. Do you want to be free, or do you want to be secure? Susan didn't answer right away. She paid for her coffee she hadn't touched and walked home instead of driving, even though it was cold. The movement helped her think. Freedom or security? She had assumed divorce meant freedom, freedom from exhaustion, from being taken for granted, from a life that felt smaller every year. But now, freedom had a price tag, and it was higher than she had ever imagined. That evening, David was in the living room, reading. He looked up when she came in. You see the financial planner? He asked. Yes, Susan said. And she sat down across from him, the same way she had after the lawyer visit. My pension is about $1,600 a month, she said. With adjustments, maybe $1,800. David nodded slowly. And rent? At least $1,200. He exhaled. That doesn't leave much. No, Susan said. It doesn't leave room to get sick. Or old. Or scared. David leaned back, rubbing his jaw. I always thought the pension was the safety net. So did I. He looked at her, really looked at her, and, for the first time, didn't try to fix anything. "So what are you saying?" he asked. Susan hesitated. "I'm saying I don't know how to choose between being unhappy and being afraid." David didn't respond right away. He glanced around the room, the couch they had picked together, the photos on the wall, the bookshelf Susan had organized by color years ago. "This is what nobody tells you," he said quietly. "When you're young, they say love is all that matters. When you're old, it's numbers." Susan felt tears rise, but she didn't wipe them away. "I don't want to be trapped," she said. David nodded. "Neither do I." They sat together in the growing darkness, not touching, not arguing, just staring at the reality neither of them had planned for. Susan realized then that divorce wasn't just an emotional decision. It was a financial cliff. And she was standing much closer to the edge than she had ever known. Susan waited until the house was quiet before calling Rachel. It was nearly 8 in the evening, just late enough that the kids would be in bed, but early enough that Rachel wouldn't be half asleep. Susan sat at the kitchen table, phone in both hands, staring at her daughter's name on the screen longer than she meant to. She hated that she was nervous. She hated that she already felt ashamed. Rachel answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." Susan forced a smile into her voice, even though Rachel couldn't see it. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" "No, it's okay," Rachel said. Susan could hear the faint hum of a dishwasher in the background. "What's going on?" Susan took a breath. I wanted to talk to you about something important." There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough for Rachel to sense that this wasn't small talk. "Okay," Rachel said carefully. "What's wrong?" Susan looked down at the table, at the familiar groove where David had once dropped a fork too hard. "Your father and we're having some problems." Rachel exhaled. "Problems how?" Susan closed her eyes. "We're talking about a possible divorce." The word sounded heavier when she said it out loud to her child. Rachel didn't respond right away. Susan imagined her daughter standing still in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, trying to process what she was hearing. "A divorce?" Rachel finally said. "Mom, are you serious?" "I wouldn't bring it up if I wasn't," Susan replied. "But you've been married forever," Rachel said. "You and Dad, you're my parents." "I know," Susan said softly. "And I didn't plan for this." Rachel's voice shifted, less shock now, more concern. "Is Dad okay?" "Did something happen?" "No," Susan said quickly. "Nothing like that. No cheating. No abuse. It's just, we've grown very far apart." Rachel was quiet again. When she spoke, her tone was cautious. "What does this have to do with me?" Susan swallowed. This was the part she had been dreading. "If we do separate," Susan said slowly, "things are going to be tight for me. Financially." Rachel didn't interrupt. "I've talked to a lawyer. A financial planner," Susan continued. "I'm not asking for much. Just a little help. Maybe $200 a month. Just to give me some breathing room." The words felt ugly in her mouth. She had spent her entire life trying not to need this conversation. On the other end of the line, Rachel was silent. Susan's chest tightened. "Rachel." "I'm here," Rachel said. Her voice sounded strained. "I'm just trying to think." Susan waited. "Mom," Rachel said finally, "I don't think I can do that." The words landed hard, even though Susan had expected them. I understand if it's difficult, Susan said quickly. It wouldn't be forever. Just until I figure things out. Rachel sighed. Mom, it's not just difficult. We can't. Susan felt a flash of heat in her chest. You and Mark both work, she said before she could stop herself. I'm not asking for thousands. Rachel's voice tightened. You know we're barely keeping up, right? Susan hesitated. She knew. But knowing something in theory was different from hearing it laid bare. Mark's student loans are still there, Rachel continued. Our mortgage went up this year. Daycare costs more than we expected. And we're trying to save, at least something, because honestly, I'm terrified of ending up in the same situation you're in now. Susan closed her eyes. That's not fair, she said quietly. I'm not saying it to be cruel, Rachel replied. I'm saying it because it's the truth. Susan felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I sacrificed a lot for you, she said, her voice breaking despite her effort to keep it steady. I worked full-time and still made sure you never went without. I know, Mom, Rachel said. And I'm grateful. I really am. But gratitude doesn't pay bills. The words stung because they were true. Rachel continued, softer now. I love you. I really do. But I can't save you without drowning myself. Susan pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to cry. That sentence, so calm, so rational, felt like a door closing. So that's it? Susan asked. You can't help me at all. Rachel hesitated. I can help you look into programs. Resources. Maybe senior housing options. Susan cut her off. I don't need research. I need support. I know, Rachel said. But I have to protect my own family, too. For a moment, Susan felt something sharp and ugly rise in her chest. Anger. Not just at Rachel, but at the world that had put them both in this position. When did it become every generation for themselves? Susan asked. Rachel was quiet. When the safety nets disappeared, she said. Susan didn't have an answer to that. They ended the call awkwardly, both saying, I love you, like it might soften what had just happened. Afterward, Susan sat alone at the kitchen table, the phone resting face down beside her. The house was dark now, quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. She thought about all the nights she had stayed up worrying about Rachel, about college, about money, about the future. She had believed, without ever saying it out loud, that one day, if she needed help, her child would be there. Not because Rachel owed her, but because that's what family did. Susan stared into the darkness, a realization settling in slowly and painfully. Her daughter wasn't cruel. She was realistic. And that made it hurt even more. When David came into the kitchen later, he found Susan sitting in the dark. You didn't turn the light on, he said gently. I talked to Rachel, Susan replied. David stopped. And she can't help, Susan said. Not financially. David nodded, unsurprised. I figured. Susan looked at him. You figured? He sighed. Our generation had pensions, affordable housing, a chance to recover from mistakes. Hers doesn't. Susan felt something inside her give way, not anger this time, but understanding laced with grief. So, that's it, she said. No help. No backup. David sat down across from her. It means whatever we do, he said quietly. We're on our own. Susan nodded slowly. In that moment, the divorce stopped feeling like a personal choice and started feeling like a generational problem, one shaped by economics, timing, and a world that had changed faster than any of them were prepared for. She realized then that leaving wouldn't just mean walking away from a marriage. It would mean walking without a safety net. And for the first time since the word divorce had entered her mind, Susan felt truly afraid. David hadn't planned on talking about his marriage that morning. The driving range was quiet, the air cool and sharp, the kind that made his joints ache just enough to remind him he wasn't young anymore. He lined up his shot, swung too hard, and watched the ball slice off to the right. "Trying to kill it won't help," a voice said behind him. David turned and saw Mark Reynolds, a longtime friend he'd known since his early days at the plant. Same age, same thinning hair, same stiff movements. But something about Mark always felt looser now, untethered. Mark had been divorced for 3 years. "Morning," David muttered. They hit balls side by side for a while without talking. The silence between men was familiar, comfortable. It wasn't until Mark missed an easy shot and cursed under his breath that David finally spoke. "You ever regret it?" David asked, staring downrange. Mark froze. He didn't ask what David meant. He knew. "Some days," Mark said slowly, "I regret not doing it sooner. Other days, I regret not doing more before it was too late." David swallowed. "Which days are worse?" Mark sighed and set his club down. "The quiet ones." They sat on a bench near the edge of the range, paper cups of burnt coffee warming their hands. David stared at the ground, unsure how much to say. "Susan's talking about divorce," he said finally. "Says she's exhausted. Says I don't see her." Mark didn't look surprised. "Did you?" The question stung. "I thought I did." Mark nodded. "So did I." David frowned. "You and Karen seemed fine. From the outside, at least." Mark let out a dry laugh. "From the outside, we were perfect. Inside, we were strangers sharing a mortgage." David shifted uncomfortably. "She never said much." "She did," Mark replied. "I just didn't listen." David looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean I nodded while watching TV," Mark said. "I said, 'uh-huh,' without hearing the words. I assumed she'd always be there, so I didn't treat her like someone I could lose." David felt his chest tighten. "Susan says I don't hear her." Mark met his eyes. "Do you?" David opened his mouth, then closed it again. Mark continued, his voice quieter now. "When Karen left, I told myself it was for the best. I told myself I deserved freedom. And you know what? At first, it felt great." "Yeah?" David asked. "No one nagging. No compromises. I ate what I wanted. Slept when I wanted. Watched whatever I wanted." Mark paused. "Then one night, I got sick. Bad stomach thing. Thought it was nothing." David listened closely. "I passed out in the bathroom," Mark said. "Woke up on the floor an hour later. No one knew. No one checked. I remember thinking, if I'd hit my head, that might have been it." David felt a chill run through him. "And that's when it hit me," Mark continued. "Freedom doesn't mean much when there's no one to notice you're gone." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of golf balls thudding against the far fence filling the space. "You know what the worst part is?" Mark said. "It's not the loneliness. It's realizing how much she did that I never noticed until she stopped doing it." David thought of Susan. The meals. The schedules. The quiet way the house always seemed to function without him thinking about how. "I didn't thank Karen," Mark went on. "Not really. I assumed she knew. David nodded slowly. Susan says she feels invisible. Mark's expression softened. That's exactly what Karen used to say. David felt something heavy settle in his chest. Do you think, if you'd listened earlier... Mark cut him off gently. I don't know. Maybe. But I do know this. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Losing your wife doesn't teach you how to live alone. It teaches you what you took for granted. David stared out at the empty range. Susan thinks divorce will give her relief. It might, Mark said. From the frustration. From the resentment. But it also comes with something no one advertises. What's that? Silence, Mark replied. A lot of it. David swallowed hard. Don't get me wrong, Mark added. I'm not telling you to trap her. Or yourself. If the marriage is dead, it's dead. But don't assume divorce fixes what listening might. David nodded slowly. She says I never ask how she's doing. Mark chuckled bitterly. Funny how hard that becomes once you've gone years without doing it. David looked down at his hands. They were rough, calloused, hands that had built machines, paid bills, fixed things that broke. He'd always believed actions mattered more than words. And if it's too late? David asked quietly. Mark didn't answer right away. Then at least you'll know you didn't lose her without trying, he said finally. I lost Karen and then spent months wishing I could go back, not to fix everything, just to say thank you out loud. David felt a lump form in his throat. Mark stood and picked up his club. One more thing, he said. People think divorce gives you a second chance. Sometimes it does. But sometimes, it just gives you a lot of time to think about the first one you wasted. David watched as Mark walked back toward the range, shoulders slightly hunched, swing still strong but slower than it used to be. On the drive home, David didn't turn on the radio. He kept hearing Mark's words in his head. Freedom didn't make me happy. It just made the silence louder. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. Neat. Quiet. Stable. Susan's car was there. David sat for a moment before getting out, his hand resting on the steering wheel. For the first time since Susan had said the word divorce, he didn't think about the house, or the money, or what people would say. He thought about waking up alone, about no one noticing if he didn't come home, about a silence that never ended. When he stepped inside, Susan was in the kitchen, rinsing a cup. Hey, she said. Hey, David replied. He watched her for a second longer than usual. How was your day? He asked. Susan paused, surprised by the question. It was long, she said carefully. David nodded. Do you want to tell me about it? She looked at him, searching his face for something she hadn't seen in a while. I do, she said. And for the first time in weeks, David felt a flicker of something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Not certainty. But the possibility that the future Mark had warned him about wasn't inevitable yet. The call came early on a Tuesday morning. David answered it half asleep, his voice rough. By the time he hung up, the fog in his head had vanished completely. My mom fell, he said when Susan came into the kitchen. She broke her hip. Susan froze. Is she okay? The surgery went well, David replied, rubbing his forehead. But the doctor says she won't be able to live alone for a while, maybe longer. They drove to the hospital that afternoon in near silence. Not the tense silence they had lived in for weeks, but something heavier. Something shared. Margaret Miller had always been a strong woman. Widowed early, she raised David and his sister mostly on her own, working part-time and stretching every dollar. Even now, at 87, she still insisted on doing her own shopping and cooking her own meals. Seeing her lying in a hospital bed, thinner than Susan remembered, unsettled both of them. "Susan," Margaret said when she saw her, a tired smile spreading across her face. "You didn't have to come." Susan took her hand gently. "Of course I did." Margaret studied her for a moment, eyes sharper than her frail body suggested. "You look tired, dear." Susan tried to brush it off. "It's just been a busy few weeks." Margaret didn't press. She rarely did. That was one of the things Susan had always respected about her. After the nurse left, David stepped out to speak with the doctor, leaving the two women alone. Margaret squeezed Susan's hand. "David told me, you two aren't doing so well." Susan hesitated. She hadn't expected this conversation here. "Yes. Now." "It's complicated," she said. Margaret nodded slowly. "It always is." Susan looked down at their joined hands. "I've been thinking about leaving," she admitted. "About divorce." Margaret didn't gasp. She didn't frown. She simply listened. "That takes courage," she said quietly. Susan looked up, surprised. "You don't think it's wrong?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I think staying miserable for the rest of your life is wrong. Leaving can be right. Staying can be right. It depends on why." Susan felt tears rise unexpectedly. "I don't know what I want anymore," she said. "I just know I'm exhausted." Margaret's grip tightened slightly. "May I tell you something I've never told David?" Susan nodded. "When his father was still alive," Margaret said, "there was a time I wanted to leave him." Susan's breath caught. "Really?" "He wasn't a bad man," Margaret continued. "He worked hard. He provided. But he didn't see me. Not really. I felt like furniture. Useful, but invisible." Susan felt a chill of recognition. "I went as far as speaking to a lawyer," Margaret said. This was decades ago. Women didn't talk about these things then. "What happened?" Susan asked. Margaret sighed. "I realized something important. I didn't want to leave my husband. I wanted my life to change." Susan frowned. "What's the difference?" Margaret looked at her carefully. "Leaving is an action. Change is a direction." Susan let the words sink in. "I thought divorce would fix everything," Margaret went on. "But when I asked myself what I really wanted, it wasn't freedom from him. It was to feel valued, to be heard." Susan's chest tightened. "That's exactly how I feel." Margaret nodded. "Then ask yourself this question, one I wish someone had asked me sooner." She paused, choosing her words with care. "Do you want a divorce? Or do you want to be seen?" Susan felt the question land deep inside her, heavy and unavoidable. "I don't know," she whispered. "That's okay," Margaret said gently. "Not knowing is the beginning of honesty." Susan wiped at her eyes. "But what if he can't change?" Margaret's gaze softened. "Then you'll know you didn't stay out of fear. You stayed because you tried." Susan swallowed. "I'm so tired of trying." "I know," Margaret said. "I was too. But trying doesn't always mean fixing everything. Sometimes it means changing how you speak, how you listen, how you show up." Susan thought of the years she had spent expecting David to notice her pain without her having to explain it. "May I ask you something else?" Margaret said, "Of course." "Do you believe David loves you?" Susan didn't answer immediately. She pictured him sitting at the kitchen table, His confusion, his defensiveness, the way he had asked how her day was for the first time in weeks. "Yes," she said finally. "I think he does. I just don't think he knows how to show it." Margaret smiled sadly. Men of his generation were taught that love looks like responsibility, not vulnerability. Susan nodded. "That sounds right." David returned then, interrupting the moment. "Everything okay?" he asked. Susan glanced at Margaret, who gave her a small, knowing nod. "We were just talking," Susan said. Margaret turned to her son. "David, your wife is a good woman." "I know," he replied quickly. "Knowing isn't the same as showing," Margaret said calmly. David looked startled, then thoughtful. Margaret continued, her voice steady despite her weakness. "I made mistakes with your father. I waited too long for him to change without telling him what I needed. He waited too long to listen. We loved each other, but love alone didn't teach us how to understand." David swallowed. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," Margaret interrupted gently, "that divorce is not failure. But neither is staying and rebuilding, if both people are willing." She looked at Susan again. "Don't cling to divorce as the only door. And don't cling to marriage as a prison either." Susan felt something shift inside her, not relief, not hope exactly, but perspective. That evening, driving home, the words echoed in her mind. "Do you want a divorce? Or do you want to be seen?" At a red light, Susan glanced at David. His eyes were fixed on the road, his jaw tight with thought. "What my mom said," he began hesitantly. "Did it help?" Susan considered her answer carefully. "It didn't solve anything," she said. "But it changed the question." David nodded slowly. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. For the first time since everything had begun unraveling, Susan realized that wanting a divorce might not mean wanting to leave. It might mean wanting something to finally be different. And that possibility, fragile, uncertain, unfinished, stayed with her long after the hospital lights faded in the rear-view mirror. Susan didn't decide anything right away. After the hospital visit, life returned to its familiar rhythm: breakfasts, quiet afternoons, dinners eaten across from each other. But something subtle had changed. The word divorce no longer sat between them like a threat. It hovered instead, like a deadline neither of them wanted to reach without being sure. 3 days later, Susan met Dr. Ann Parker, a marriage counselor recommended by a former colleague. The office was modest, the walls lined with books instead of diplomas. It felt less like a clinic and more like a place for thinking. "Before we talk about fixing anything," Dr. Parker said, "I want to ask you a simple question." Susan nodded. "Do you want out?" the counselor asked, "or do you want something different?" Susan hesitated. The answer that came surprised her. "I want to feel like I exist," she said. Dr. Parker smiled gently. "That's more common than you think." They talked for nearly an hour. About invisible labor. About resentment that grows quietly. About how couples often confuse endurance with love. At the end, Dr. Parker leaned back in her chair. "I'm not going to ask you to save your marriage," she said. "I don't believe in forcing outcomes." Susan tensed. "Then what do you suggest?" "A trial," Dr. Parker replied. 3 months. Susan frowned. "Like a separation?" "No," she said. "Like an experiment." Susan listened carefully as the counselor explained. "For 3 months, Dr. Parker said, you and your husband do not argue about the past. You don't decide the future. You simply test one thing, whether connection is still possible. And how do we do that? Susan asked. By changing behavior, not intentions, Doctor. Parker replied. Small, consistent actions. She slid a small notebook across the desk. Each of you writes down one thing a day, she continued. Something the other person did that you noticed. Something you appreciated. It doesn't have to be big. And you don't have to show each other unless you want to. Susan stared at the notebook. That sounds simplistic. It is, Doctor, Parker said. That's why it works. Susan thought about all the complicated plans she had made over the years that never changed how she felt. What if it doesn't work? She asked. Then you'll know, the counselor said. And you'll know you didn't leave without clarity. That night, Susan told David about the idea as they washed dishes side by side. A 3-month experiment, she said, drying her hands on a towel. Not to fix things, just to see if we can change how we are with each other. David frowned. You mean therapy? Partly, Susan said, but mostly paying attention. David considered this. And after 3 months. Then we decide, Susan said. Together or apart? He was quiet for a long moment. And if I mess it up? Susan met his eyes. Then we write that down too. David exhaled. I don't know if I'm good at this kind of thing. I don't know if I am either, Susan said. They agreed to try. The first week was awkward. David wrote his first note with the same care he used to approach technical drawings, staring at the page as if it might judge him. Susan made coffee before I woke up. He crossed it out. Too obvious. Susan keeps the house running. That felt empty. Eventually, he wrote. Susan asked me how my day was. I realized she doesn't have to. Susan's notebook stayed mostly blank the first few days. She noticed things, but noticing didn't always lead to gratitude. Sometimes it led to irritation. On the 4th day, she wrote, David took out the trash without being asked. She stared at the sentence, annoyed that this was what counted as progress. Then she caught herself. At least I noticed, she thought. The second week was harder. They argued quietly, but sharply, about groceries, about tone, about things that had nothing to do with groceries or tone. One night, Susan didn't write anything at all. She stared at the empty page and finally wrote, Today, I didn't feel grateful. I felt tired. David had his own failures. He forgot to ask follow-up questions. He slipped back into old habits, nodding without listening. But something else was happening too. He started seeing how often Susan moved through the house without stopping, how many decisions she made without comment, how much she carried without asking. One morning, Susan woke to the sound of dishes clinking. She came into the kitchen to find David scrambling eggs, his movements uncertain but determined. I thought I'd try, he said. Susan watched him for a moment, surprised by the knot in her throat. Thank you, she said. It wasn't the eggs that mattered. It was the effort. By the end of the first month, neither of them felt fixed. But the house felt different. Quieter in a new way. Less heavy. They began sharing parts of their notebooks, not every day, not ceremoniously, just occasionally. This one made me think, David said once, sliding his notebook across the table. Susan read. I didn't realize how much Susan does until I tried to do it myself. She didn't smile. But something loosened in her chest. In the second month, Susan caught herself laughing at something David said. It startled her. The sound felt unfamiliar, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. They still had bad days. Days where resentment flared. Days where Susan wondered if she was just delaying the inevitable. One evening, she said it out loud. "What if this is just us getting better at pretending?" David didn't argue. "Then we'll know," he said. "But I don't think pretending feels like this." "What does it feel like to you?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Like I'm finally awake." The third month came quietly. No grand gestures. No dramatic breakthroughs. Just accumulation. More questions asked. More answers given. Fewer assumptions. One night, Susan wrote. David listened without interrupting. Another night, "I felt lonely, and I said so." He didn't fix it. He stayed. As the 3 months drew to a close, Susan realized something unexpected. She wasn't counting the days anymore. She wasn't waiting for the experiment to end. She was noticing how it felt to be noticed. And that, more than anything, made the question of divorce feel different, not smaller, not gone, but no longer the only possible answer. The 3 months ended without ceremony. No date circled on the calendar. No conversation that started with, "So, what's the verdict?" Life simply kept moving, and one morning, Susan realized she couldn't remember the last time she had thought about leaving the house with a suitcase in her hand. That realization scared her more than it comforted her. It wasn't because everything was suddenly perfect. It wasn't. They still disagreed. David still forgot things. Susan still felt waves of exhaustion that no apology could erase. But something had shifted, quietly, permanently. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. A small cardboard box arrived in the mail, addressed to David in his mother's careful handwriting. Inside was an old photo album, the leather cover cracked with age. "I think this belongs with you," Margaret had written. "I don't need it where I'm going." They sat together on the couch, the album resting between them like something fragile. The first photo made Susan laugh softly despite herself. "Oh my God," she said. "Look at us." David leaned in. "You had that haircut everyone had in the 80s. "You had hair," Susan shot back. They turned the pages slowly. A tiny apartment. A borrowed couch. A Christmas tree that leaned dangerously to one side. Susan remembered how poor they'd been, and how hopeful. "I was terrified," David said quietly. "Back then." Susan glanced at him. "Of what?" "Of not being enough for you," he admitted. "You were so capable. So smart. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could make up for everything else I didn't know how to be." Susan felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but this time, it wasn't resentment. "I never knew you felt that way," she said. David nodded. "I never told you. I thought love was supposed to look like endurance, like holding everything together and not complaining." Susan traced the edge of a photo with her finger. "I thought love was supposed to look like being needed." They sat in silence. The album opened to a picture of Rachel as a toddler, her hands smeared with frosting, Susan laughing behind the camera. "I think we confused being necessary with being connected," Susan said. David swallowed. "I think you're right." That night, Susan lay awake listening to David's breathing beside her. For months, she had focused on the fear of being alone, of waking up in a quiet apartment, of getting sick with no one to notice. But now, another fear surfaced. What if I stay and stop choosing again? The next morning, she said it out loud. I don't want us to slide back into silence, Susan said as they sat at the kitchen table. I'm afraid of that more than I'm afraid of divorce. David nodded. Me too. So, what do we do? She asked. David thought for a moment. We keep choosing, not because it's cheaper, not because it's safer, but because we're still here and we're still trying. Susan studied him. And if we stop trying, then we talk about it, he said, before it turns into resentment. Susan exhaled slowly. That would be new. David smiled faintly. We're late learners. Later that week, they met with Dr. Parker one last time. So, the counselor said, what have you decided? Susan answered first. We're not divorcing. Dr. Parker waited. But, Susan continued, we're also not pretending everything is fine. David nodded. We're staying because we're choosing to, not because we're afraid to leave. Dr. Parker smiled. That's the difference between a prison and a commitment. As they walked out of the office, Susan felt something unexpected. Not relief. Ownership. That evening, David cooked dinner badly. The chicken was dry. The vegetables were overcooked. Susan laughed anyway. Thank you, she said. For what? David asked. For trying, Susan replied. They sat down to eat, not across from each other this time, but side by side at the small kitchen table, knees touching. Susan looked around the house that had once felt like a trap. It still held limitations. It still represented financial reality. But it no longer felt like the reason she stayed. Later, as they washed dishes together, Susan realized something else. Divorce hadn't been a mistake to consider. It had been a message. A signal that something fundamental had been missing, and that ignoring it any longer would have meant losing herself entirely. Choosing to stay wasn't surrender. It was a different kind of courage. That night, Susan opened her notebook one last time. She wrote, I stayed, not because I couldn't leave, but because I didn't want to disappear anymore. David, in his own notebook, wrote, I learned that love isn't proven by how much you provide, but by how much you notice. They placed the notebooks in a drawer together. Not as a promise that everything would be easy, but as a reminder that silence was no longer acceptable. Susan turned off the light and climbed into bed. David reached for her hand, not urgently, not dramatically. Just enough to say, I'm here. She squeezed back. The future was still uncertain. Aging still loomed. Money was still tight. Fear hadn't vanished. But neither had choice. And for the first time in a long time, Susan felt something steady beneath her exhaustion. Not happiness, not certainty, but something quieter and far more durable. Presence. Divorce is often talked about as freedom, a fresh start, a clean break. But what no one talks about is the cost, not just emotional, but financial, physical, and deeply human. For many people in their 60s and 70s, divorce isn't a doorway. It's a cliff. Housing becomes uncertain. Income shrinks. Health risks grow. And the safety nets people assume will be there often aren't. This story isn't saying divorce is wrong. And it's not saying staying is noble. It's saying something more uncomfortable. Many people don't want to leave their marriage. They want to stop disappearing inside it. Years of silence don't explode. They erode. Partners don't always grow apart because of betrayal or cruelty. Sometimes, they grow apart because no one is listening anymore. And by the time someone finally says, I want a divorce, what they're really saying is, I don't want to feel invisible for the rest of my life. The tragedy isn't divorce. The tragedy is reaching old age without ever being truly seen. Whether you're married, divorced, or somewhere in between, this story asks one question. Are you staying because you choose to, or because you're afraid of what leaving would cost? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but avoiding it has a cost too. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people watch videos like this silently because these are questions we're taught not to ask out loud. So let me ask you, if you were in their place, what would you do? Would you choose freedom, even if it meant uncertainty? Or would you try to rebuild connection before walking away? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else who's struggling right now. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that don't judge, don't preach, and don't simplify life, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Late Truths.